Imagine falling asleep not to silence, but to the low shuffle of sandals on gravel, the quiet muttering of Latin in the dark, the metallic clink of armor being adjusted by five-or-age tea. This is what Roman soldiers heard as they lay on hard. Earth beneath the stars, a world of discipline, superstition, and ghost stories passed from tent to tent. Close your eyes and drift off to the eerie hum of history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so the next time you sleep, the past is waiting for you. You arrive with the column as the light drains from the sky. When the color of dust on your boots blends almost exactly with the dry grass and the exposed soil of the chosen field. You would not call it a field for long. As soon as the sign is given, the habitual, almost automatic choreography begins. You feel it in the way the line slows and then opens, how men peel off toward the places they have been told 100 times, over to find without needing to look down at marks in the earth. The surveyors have already paced it, and their chords and measured strides, matched to the shadow length of the late sun, have laid out a new geometry. You hear it even before you think of it, a thudding rhythm as the first stakes go in at the corners, a sharp clack as wooden pegs strike stone, an exhalation through teeth as someone takes the strain on a rope. It always starts like this, with the low sounds of making the world regular again. The night will come all the same, but by the time it does, you will have a rectangle drawn against it. Straight lines where otherwise there would be only the ragged edge of darkness. The ditch and rampart begin as a suggestion, then become a fact. The slow scoop of soil, the scrape of iron on hard earth, the soft collapse of a shovel's load onto the growing bank, the tangle of grass and roots yielding with a sigh. The air smells of damp dirt and trampled plants, and you hear 100 small sounds of men bending, lifting, passing baskets hand to hand. A rhythm begins: pull, toss, step, pull, toss. Step hand in that rhythm, you find a sort of reassurance. That is not quite comfort, but close to it. You glance toward the set places, the gate that faces the way you came, the avenue that crosses the camp, the center where the command tent will rise, all so ordinary as to be invisible until you stop. To remember what they prevent, you move past the mules, their harness jingling softly, a click and tap that becomes part of the noise of evening in camp. If you pause, you can isolate the creak of leather drying after a day of strain, the flutter of a tether line as a mule flicks its ears, the grunt as a pack is eased to the ground. You hear the rip of rope through chapped hands, the little huffs of breath from the animals, and then the brief snort that signals the animal has found its balance. You know precisely where to set your own pack. There is no drama in it, only the relief of putting weight down. The knowledge that you will pick it up again in the morning, and it will feel heavier, as it always does. The tents go up in a sequence that can be executed half asleep. Poles lifted into place with dull thuds, pegs hammered into the ground, the sound of the mallet resonant and wooden, not hollow, not sharp, a sound you know by feel as much as by ear. The canvas smells of grease and rain and old smoke. The tent ropes sing a little as tension settles into them, a small, taut note as the fibers twist. You tighten them the way you were taught, a pull, a check, and then a second pull to seat the knot, because the wind can be capricious at night. And nothing sounds worse than a loose flap lifting and slapping and flapping again, stealing sleep. An inch at a time. On the perimeter, the ditch grows deeper, and the rampart takes the shape of its own shadow. The edge of the camp is noisy now with activity, but that noise is purposeful, repetitive, and in its repetition, mind-clearing. A shovel scrapes, a basket thumps down, the dirt pats into place under feet, and the stakes are set along the lip. Their tips angled, their bodies jammed by hand and foot into the packed earth. There is nothing elegant about it. Even the men who do it best do it in the same ordinary way, sweating with their sleeves rolled. not for glory, but because this is what keeps the sleep quiet and the night manageable. The first fires are kindled. Close to the ground, tight and contained, with a mind for how much light they throw. You can hear the whispers of flame licking at twigs, the crackle as a twig snaps and the first coals begin to settle with that particular sound like a soft sigh. It is a sound that seems small and controlled against the big emptiness of the land. Around you, someone is grinding grain, the soft rumble of a small hand mill turning, the scrape of stone on stone and the grit sound of grain being crushed into meal. It is a domestic sound, made in the middle of earthworks and centuries, but those are the sounds that reassure the most. The cooking pots will soon add their gentle boiling, lids rattling a little when the steam catches them. Oh, the smell of the mash and the smoke tells you what this night will be like. It will be like all the others. When the first call comes, it is not loud. Ahornlow.com. Nothing of alarm, and it rounds the edge of the camp with a long note that passes over you like a hand smoothing a blanket. You know what it means, but even if you did not, the men, moving with their particular purpose, would tell you. The first watch is being set, and the night is being divided into its portions. The centuries detail the men for the wall, the gates, the avenues, the standards. You can hear the names being called in a dozen accents, the same names that have been called in the same way for years. The familiar syllables turning over as reliably as the grinding cereal stones turn over under the pressure of human hands. There is a comfort in hearing someone else's name when it is not your turn. There is a different comfort when it is your name and you stand without fuss and take the duty as you always do. Near the center, you hear a different quiet. The command space takes form, not with great noise, but with deliberate movements, a rustle of fabric as awnings are drawn taut, the soft rattle of metal fixings against poles, the measured footsteps of men who have spent years making their presence felt in exactly this manner. A crate is set down with care rather than dropped. The murmur of a voice that will carry in daylight is domesticated into a low tone that somehow still reaches the ears that need to hear it. Here, even the dogs that have followed with the baggage detail settle into watchfulness, their ears moving toward sounds you barely register. Their chains make a soft metallic whisper, unlike the brighter jingling of mule harness, and the distinction becomes part of your mental map. Mule jingles mean movement. Dog chain whispers mean settled WATCHFULNESS. At the gate that faces the day's road, you can hear the particular cadence of a challenge and reply practiced so long it has shed all edges. It is a formality, the passphrase of the night carried from hand to hand along the arm of connection, stretched from the center of command to the outer darkness. The men at the gate call and are answered in the quiet tones that keep light where it belongs. You can almost recite the exchanges without thinking about it. Between these little pulses of speech, you hear the other sounds that belong to an entrance. The ongoing trundle of a late pack animal coming in with a group that fell. Behind the guiding whisper of its handler, the brief scrape of hoof on stone. There is a tightening of rope, a grumble from someone tired, a chuckle that is not quite laughter, but is something like it. The kind of sound that honors the small comic turn of a day without making it important. When you pass along the interior avenue, you hear the difference between tent, cloth, and leather, between a cloak being shaken loose and a scabbard being set down. Caligay make their own sound. The iron nails in their soles clicking differently on packed earth than on stone chips. And you know by listening whether the surface is firm enough to hold its shape after rain. Someone has a cough with a dry catch to it, a cough you have heard for weeks now. It will be better with warm drink and worse in the cold hours before dawn. Somewhere, another man snores. He denies it every morning. He will deny it tomorrow, too. The blacksmiths, if they work at night, keep their work small. The forge whispers rather than roars. and the hammer strokes are measured and damped with a cloth or a habit of patience, moved to a temporary anvil. Set on earth instead of stone so the vibrations resolve into ground. The iron rings against iron in short, economic notes, not the singing blows of day when new tools are shaped, but the tapping repairs of a rivet reseated, a strap remade, pot handle tightened so it does not rattle when carried. In a steady camp, you can tell the needs of a unit by the sounds of its smiths. Tonight, in a marching camp, you hear maintenance and readiness, the music of things made sound for the work ahead. You pause near the place where water is stored. There you hear the particular trickle as a skin settles and air replaces what was. Poured out, a soft glug that could be a stream if you let your mind drift. A cup is dipped, a gulp swallowed, and then the involuntary half-sigh that follows water taken after work. The taste is familiar. A little leather, a little earth, sometimes. A faint sourness, if the skin was sealed with the last of a vinegar wash. It will not be cold for long. The cool of evening is already warming as the skins come to the camp's temperature. And the men drink earlier to remember this. When full dark arrives, it is less of a leap than you expect, because the measured light at the center, the tight cones of firelight at the tent doors have already taken the place of the sun. The crackle is settled now, coals red and muffled. A few small flames licking and showing the curve of a hand, the edge of a face, the dull gleam of a buckle or a ring. Conversations taper, not because orders have hushed them, though orders have their place, but because the day has been long and the business of making a safe night has been done well. No one says this. You simply hear it in the way the camp quiets. A murmur here, a spoon against a bowl there, a low word shared, then the soft drop into sleep of men who can sleep anywhere because they have had to. The small shift of bodies, finding positions that keep sore places from getting worse, the slow exhale, and then the long silence where breath is the main sound. On the rampart, the watch settles into its own rhythm. Footsteps on the packed earth atop the bank. Not quick, not slow, the pace that covers a length in a measured time. The watchers speak to each other to keep alert. They use the same phrases night after night, consisting of nothing necessary and everything important. How many stars are visible? How the wind smells of river or of dust? Whether the air feels like damp coming or dry weather? Whether an owl called or a fox yipped out in the open? Their voices barely rise above a whisper, and that quiet speaks. More of control than of fear. The chain of them marks the edge of sleep. Beyond, there may be other night sounds, distant animals. A traveler's cart far off on another road you will not take. But here the sounds are both the wall and the gate. You hear patrols crossing the interior. The sharper click of hobnailed sandals on a stretch of stone laid down for wear. They pass, speak the expected words to men at the gate, and move along. There is a particular weight to the footsteps of men on duty in the night. It is not heavier or lighter than daytime. It is simply marked by purpose without hurry. You can identify the presence of an officer by the pattern of pause, how he stops just long enough to listen. How the men in his presence don't alter their steps because there is nothing to hide and nothing to show. The camp breathes, and you breathe with it. A long, slow expansion and contraction measured in incense of wood smoke and the faint tang of iron and leather. In your tent, the night is organized without anyone saying so. One man lies near the entrance for an easy exit when the watch changes. One lies near the rear because he sleeps heavier and needs the longer moment to wake without confusion. Cloaks. Make pillows and blankets both, and there is a security in the smell of your own cloth and the close presence of the men with whom you have shared so many nights like this, that counting them is pointless. The tent cloth moves a little with wind. A soft brushing sound like the touch of a broom, and you know if a stake is loosening by the tone of that brush. It is not magic. It is simply familiarity with 100 small variations in ordinary sounds. The first watch proceeds, and you can feel the time go not by clocks, but by the length of quiet between patrols, by the slow settling of coals into ash, by the cooling of the air as sweat finally dries and the warmth in your core yields, if you are not careful, to a chill at the edges. You think of your feet, check them without conscious deciding to do so. Flex toes against the memory of today's march. Wrap the edge of the cloak under heels so they do not contact cold ground. Someone in the next tent turns and sighs a long sigh that ends halfway between wakefulness and dreams. Beyond that, another man mutters a phrase, maybe a name, maybe a fragment of a prayer, then falls silent. You don't examine it. Nights are for thoughts that can be quieted, not curiosity that must be satisfied. There are small noises that you only notice because tonight you are paying attention. A strap settling on a peg and creaking lightly as fibers realign themselves. The faint rustle of a mouse or small lizard along the edge of a tent wall. The far-off echo of a horn from some other unit's camp, distorted by distance into something more like wind than a call, but still a signal that you are not alone in this landscape. Your mind gathers these threads and tucks them into the blanket of the night, pulling them to your chin and letting your eyelids lower. Not to sleep quite yet, but to that idle space in which you are aware without attending. The necessary orders appear in their own time. A voice murmurs at the tent door, the words few and regular. The man for the next duty rises without making much of it. You hear the slight click as his belt finds its notch, the careful movement of the curtain to avoid letting in too much draft, the almost inaudible brush of his hand against the tent pole as he turns to go. These are the minute sounds that tell you a camp is working, that it is the machine of human attention distributed in manageable parts. No one has to think about the whole of it, because everyone contributes the piece that fits where they are. By the perimeter, a sentry might hum. Under his breath, no song you can place, a tuneless string of notes barely shaped, enough to time his steps and keep the edge of drowsiness at bay. He stares into the dark beyond the staked rampart, and what he hears is the negative of sound, the expectation that is not met. No brush of grass under feet, no clink of metal where it ought not be, no whisper of men or animals approaching. In that lack, there is safety even when you cannot see far. He shifts his weight, and the leather of his armor murmurs a little. His hand rests where it always rests on his spear, fingers finding the smooth alternation of wood grain as if it were a rosary of the secular sort. The night wears on. The first portion stretching, it seems, a little longer than you remembered. They often feel that way, the first hours after a day that did not stop until the camp rose like a conjured town. But the routine of sound around you measures it, assures you that nothing is being wasted. This is the necessary quiet that sits between the days. If you could draw it, you would draw it as a narrow band across a long scroll of marching and building and marching again. In sound, it is that band inside which only ordinary noises occur, and each is a marker of function. The breath, the murmur, the footfall, the creak, the soft snore, the low question and answer at a gate. Somewhere, a dog gives one soft bark, only one, then shifts on its paws and settles. You hear the tiny jingle of chain, and then nothing more. In another place, a tent flap moves with a small whip of cloth. A man re-enters after relieving himself beyond the line where that is permitted. He is careful with the curtain, careful with his steps, because even tired men can be careful when their awareness is tuned by habit. The faintest odor of damp earth follows him in, and you think of the ditch outside, the good work of its depth and shape, and the stakes atop it, leaning outward to make an approach longer and more awkward than any intruder prefers in the dark. You think, too, of how many times your nights have sounded exactly like this. You add in your head, without meaning to, the number of campaigns, the number of seasonal tramps from river to river, the number of times the layout has fallen into place in an hour that would exhaust a man who did not know how to do it. The sounds of evening in the camp have changed you, though you would be hard-pressed to say how. You are calmed by the chafing of rope through calloused hands, the even rub of cloth on wood, the soft padding of coals. Not because any of it is beautiful, but because all of it is predictable. Predictability is a kind of shelter you carry in your ears when the end of the first watch draws near. There is no sudden change, but a quiet gathering of intent. The men who will relieve the walls move earlier so that the guard is never thinner than it should be. Those who are coming in let their eyes adjust to the lower light under the tent rows, their ears to the thicker quiet after the edge of the camp, where the wind sings a little more. The last exchange of the watch is as unremarkable as the first. There is a murmured phrase, a nod, a brief touching of the wooden shaft of a spear between men who have held the same place against the night. No one lingers over it. A watch is not a thing to be sentimental about. It is a portion of the work done properly. No more and no less. You find yourself listening for the moment when one rhythm ends and another begins, when the soundscape of the night shifts its tiny weights from 1 hour to the next. It is not a horn that marks it for you, though there may be a low note given in the distance. It is the way the footsteps on the rampart take a new cadence, the way a tent flap settles after the last man enters for this portion, the way the fire at the center is tended once more and then left to its covering of ash. You think? This is the sound of a machine that knows its work. You think? This is how we make the dark ordinary. And as you lie back, cloak pulled to your chin, feet tucked under its edge, eyes closed, but hearing everything, you find your mind turning. Not to fear, not to longing, but to the smallest curiosity that belongs to all nights like this. When the next watch comes and goes, and the one after that, will the sound of the night change with the temperature and the wind? Or will it hold steady under the weight of so many men breathing the same air with the same measure? By the time the second watch begins, the camp has settled into that depth of quiet in which a cough carries farther than it should, and the pop of a coal in a covered bed seems briefly like a larger sound. Your ears adjust to detail the way eyes adjust to darkness. You begin to recognize the second watch by these details. The air cools further, and you can hear it in the tightening of leather. The small creak when a strap draws taut as the night shrinks with the cold. The fabric of the tents has taken on a different note when it moves, a drier rustle as any lingering damp from the day's march finally lifts. The ground itself feels different under footfalls, harder where a thin film of moisture that softened. The surface at dusk has now resolved into a crust that resists a little before it yields. This is the quiet center of the night, and it spans long enough that you forget sometimes where you are in it until the pattern breaks for duty or a patrol passes. The voices of the sentries in the second watch are more spaced. Men speak less. Often not because they flag, but because they have found their pace and their way of listening. The words that are offered are functional. A number confirming a count. A brief note about the wind. A comment on a star slipping behind a cloud. This is also the time when your hearing gains practice in distinguishing the layers of sound that overlay each other to make up what you call silence. There is the background murmur of sleeping bodies, the occasional turning on a bedroll, the softer exhalations of those who have found the deep part of sleep, and the harsher exhalations of those who have not. There is the slow ticking of cooling metal, where a pot left too near the coals contracts by imperceptible degrees. There is the minute movement of ash settling, the unmusical yet rhythmic whisper of particles finding a new equilibrium at the perimeter. The second watch inherits a landscape that is more its own than the first. the last improbable travelers have found their own night's rest. The animals beyond the ditch settle into whatever burrows or nests protect them from the worst of the chill. A fox may move along the boundary and set the dog to a single warning. But even the fox prefers the untroubled service roads and the shallow paths between grasses to the glare of the limited light that marks a human space. The sentry hears a small rustle and does not mistake it for a footfall. He has trained himself in that with eyes closed on other nights. The way you have trained yourself to tell whether a tent peg is loosening by the sound of canvas over rope. These are skills without naming ceremonies, but they are as real as any. Rank awarded by a centurion's fine stick, the watchword passes along the line periodically. A brief exchange to verify that attention has not thinned. The password itself is dull on purpose. It is neither witty nor memorable, while still being distinct enough to avoid confusion with the ordinary words of speech. When the Tesserarius began his rounds in the early night, he carried the word from the place of command and whispered it to the men who would share it, ensuring that no voice would be raised, that no syllable would be shouted to the night. You can hear the practice in the way the word jumps from one post to the next, like a stone placed by one hand and then another, in a dry, shallow stream to mark a crossing. You might not be able to make out the word itself if you stood at a distance, but you would hear the rhythm of its passing. And that rhythm would tell you more than any content could do. In the inner avenues, patrols still pass at intervals set by experience rather than rule, because the night is a thing to be managed by those who feel it more than by those who order it. The footfalls of these patrols define the center of the place like the spokes of a wheel. The men who walk the beats through the medium of sleep do not cut their corners. They do not glance down side lanes with only their eyes and call it good. They do not speed up in the darkness to get it over with. You hear it in the way their steps neither quicken nor lag at the points where path meets path and tent row meets tent row. They are the moving parts of a watch that must be in even pressure, applied over hours. If the sound of their passage were written down, it would show regular intervals with subtle variations that only a lax ear would miss. The best patrols carry within them a sense of pace so steady that you can measure your thoughts by them sometimes. In the second watch, the camp's inner operations persist in restrained ways. A man with a sore foot will stir, and the characteristic grate of grit shaken from a sandal will mark his attempt to banish an annoyance before it grows. If the medicus is required, his coming is without ceremony. You hear the small rattle of a pouch of tools, the small click of an instrument set down, the low exchange of practical words, and then the fading away as he moves on. Night is when infections speak in small ways, when bandages loosen, when aches declare themselves with the authority of quiet. The sounds associated with tending are careful and few. Water pours into a small cup, a tone like a voice in a clay throat. A cork or plug is eased and then pressed back. A reassurance is given, not in words that promise anything the medic cannot deliver, but in phrases that return a man to his own ordinary expectations. This will hold until day. This will ease, and then you will sleep. You hear the small economies of care in other ways too. A man wakes to check his sword belt and sits up, not trusting his fingers to find the hole by feel this time, but wanting to verify that leather will not stiffen into an unmanageable shape before morning. No one is proud in these moments. One thinks such things accidentally undone will make them a lesser soldier. The camp itself encourages this sort of small attention. The sound of someone quietly oiling a buckle or lifting a peg and resetting it to relieve a rope that has taken too much strain is the sound of a system that makes such acts unremarkable. In the history you carry in your habits, the difference between a night passed in passive endurance and a night passed in active maintenance is the difference between waking ready and waking resentful. The commander's tent and the tent that holds the unit's standards and records produce their own infrequent signs of life. Paper scratches under a stylus with a dry sound that tells you the ink is not generous tonight. Wax tablets receive and give back the impression of letters with a gentle press that is almost silent except to the man holding the stylus. In some commands, a slave or clerk will do such work by the light of a stump of candle trimmed to offer. Light but not make shadows leap. You do not see any of this. You hear it only as an occasional chair leg nudging the ground, an intermittent cough suppressed, a brief opening of a tent flap, and the nearly soundless step outside to void a bladder and then return. If you did not know what such sounds meant, you would hear only restlessness. Because you hear the steady conduct of small governance. Sometimes the second watch carries a more disconcerting sound, the voice from the dark beyond the ditch that is not animal. It is rare. Most nights, nothing approaches closer than wind. On a rare night, voices carry from far enough away that you cannot learn their words, only know by the pitch that they belong to men. They may be no threat. A shepherd may be calling to a dog. An outlying camp of allies or merchants may be handling their own watchfulness. You listen closely. The sentry's responses are reliable, an increase in attention. A glance exchanged, a tightening of the hand on wood, not a rush toward the outer line or a shout that would disturb the entire place. Even this small potential tension has a familiar sound. It is the sound of prepared stillness, of attention narrowing like the aperture of an eye in bright light, of readiness that does not anticipate a particular action but is prepared to take on any of those actions in their turn. The men at the gate shift into the particular stance that conserves energy while allowing speed. And the quiet addition of a second pair of eyes at each post is accomplished, with no more fuss than the adding of a log to a banked fire. This watch sometimes carries the small amusements that men permit themselves as defenses against monotony. There is the ritual of counting breaths to a pace, of matching inhales to the length of the ditch and exhales to the length of the rampart. There is the cataloging of distant night scents, the learning to tell one herb from another when crushed underfoot in the shortcut grass. In the second watch, men might silently chew a sprig of something bitter to keep their mouths awake and their minds focused. The sound is nigh non-existent, but the habit marks the watch, a faint, slow grinding between teeth that is not hunger. Not anxiety, just a way of knowing where you are in the long center of the night. Closer to the center, someone turns a small grindstone quietly, perhaps sharpening a stake point or giving a touch to a knife dulled on the day's work. The tone of stone on metal is gentle, a whispering shush, like a small stream under grass. It does not cut across the camp's quiet. It joins it. There is a discipline in keeping even these necessary noises within the accepted bounds. No one is shouted down for making the camp's business audible. No one is indulged for making a show of diligence by dragging out a noise longer than needed. In these small calibrations, a unit's character shows itself more easily than in battle, where noise has a different meaning. Time passes without markers that insist on themselves, and yet the second watch is the one in which you notice hunger. If your evening portion was light, the belly grumbles are low and unproud. A man might reach for a scrap saved from the meal, the soft tug of bread tearing a swallow, and then the return to the steady baseline of night sounds. A drink of watered wine or sour water quells more than it satisfies, but it does enough. In a different tent, a man wakes and considers stepping out to relieve himself, and you can predict the course of his decision by the way he shifts his weight and the brief lift of the tent flap. You do not see him go, but you know the track he will take. The place set aside for such needs, the quick, careful step that keeps him from projecting his presence, and the even more careful step that returns it. You hear the internal moral economy operating in all of this. A man warns himself away from smoking a twig near the tent flap, knowing that the ember's faint glow could be seen, that it could start a night panic for no reason. He refrains without thinking of it as refraining. The tent mate who stirs from a dream says nothing that would disturb the others. The sentry who catches his mind slipping pulls it back with an agreed trick, counting, reciting a neutral list, names of months or past commanders, or stations, speaking them in his head into the rhythm of his steps. All of this floats on the silence like a fine net that does not snag anything big, because the big things are not present here tonight, but which keeps the small habits in place and stops their drifting into sloth. Sometimes. 2. The second watch lets you hear the geography you have been ignoring. Wind creates its own voice over the ditch. A low reverberation if the ditch is deep. A higher moan if the sides are steep and the airflow constricted. The stakes atop the ramparts sing in the wind in a way that tells you whether they are tight, almost like the strings of a crude harp, to loose, and they thrum a wordless reprimand to the men who set them. Just right, and they mute the wind's ambition into a dull murmur. Even without getting up, you can map the corners of the camp by these subtle differences in tone carried through taut canvas and porous air. It is an unheralded skill, perhaps, but the kind that has kept more than one man alive when he needed to move in a night thick with confusion. Gradually, the second watch passes its quiet to the men of the third, and here the transition is different. If the first watch hands off after the memory of strain and building, the second watch hands off after the maintenance of equilibrium. The third watch has its own personality. It is the time when cold penetrates the easiest, when fatigue sneaks in at angles you did not notice before, when relief feels close enough to touch and yet unattainable enough to make your hand clench. Can hear the shift even before the men themselves acknowledge it. There is a slight increase in the sound of cloth being adjusted. Of footsteps stamped more firmly as men warm themselves and test the readiness of their boots to carry them through the hour or two ahead. Before that handover, though there comes sometimes a small disturbance that is not a threat but is an alarm in the old sense, a call to alertness. The horn might sound with a note that tells its listeners to stand to their posts and observe. Not an alarm that calls for arms in hand and a rush to the ditch, but a reminder that the night is still the night and it deserves attention. The sound settles back into quiet quickly. You wonder whether it was a fox again or a stray mule from a supply train that came late to the rendezvous and is now finding its way. The point is not the cause. The point is the readiness. The meaning is not in the event. The meaning is in the way the camp's sound decays back to normal, demonstrating that nothing required breaking the pattern. As your listening draws you into a calm that is neither wakefulness nor sleep, you imagine tracing the night, not with your feet, but with your ears. Walking the line between tent and ditch along a path made of breaths and whispers and careful footfalls. You imagine you could get from one gate to the opposite without opening your eyes, only by following the minor chord of the rampart's windsong or the metronome of a patrol's heel turn at the end of a row. Then your mind returns to the small question that belongs to all midnights as the third watch takes the camp into the coldest part of the night. What sound will betray the first hint of dawn? The horn, the rooster from some distant farmhouse. The barely audible shift in sleeping voices, or will the camp hold its steady note until the fourth watch declares morning? In the third watch, the cold settles like an additional layer of cloth where none exists. You feel it in your fingers. First, then in your feet, then across your shoulders where the cloak's warmth thins at its edges. The sounds in this watch seem to carry farther, as if the air's tightening gives them a clearer path. A cough in one tent echoes 2 rows down. A boot stamp near the gateway is heard all along the interior road. The men on watch know they must keep moving, but they know equally that quick steps can provoke false alarms as readily as laziness can let danger past. So the rhythm here is purposeful, deliberate, with a little more emphasis at the end of each turn on the rampart. A firm stamp to send blood down to toes that ache. A firm exhale to fog the air and watch it vanish before the eyes as proof. That breath is work and life is present. The camp under cold emits a different sequence of small notes. Canvas, which earlier rustled, now crackles a little when disturbed, a crisper sound as fibers tighten. Leather belts squeak faintly, unless they have been greased. Well, metal is quieter because it has no heat to give up. It sits inert, no longer ticking as it did when cooling after fire. The firebeds themselves are altered, heat banked deep under ash that insulates it against both air and damp, emitting only an occasional soft shift as embers collapse inward. The smoke, no longer eager, crawls and sticks, and in the stillness is almost nothing at all, as if the camp has decided to breathe slowly enough to be unnoticed. This is when you hear fatigue most plainly. It does not announce itself in snores or even in silence. It shows up in those tiny lapses of precision that the ear detects better than the eye. A guard spear, but set down a little heavier than before, then lifted with a small scrape. Foot turned a little wider at the end of a pacing run, the heel dragging just enough to leave a sound mark in the compacted earth. A watch passphrase spoken with a fractionally slower delivery that betrays how the mind had to reach farther to retrieve it. These are not failures. They are simply markers of humanness. When men on duty catch themselves making such sounds, they correct gently. The way the hand corrects a quivering ink line into steadiness with a more measured breath. You hear, too, the tense cape of the camp responding to the cold. Those who sleep pull cloaks tighter, and the resulting rustle is like a soft wave that passes through the rows. The man who sleeps nearest the door shifts to take advantage of the warmer air inside. The man at the back moves to ease stiffness in his hip that always complains at this hour. Some will mutter, some will dream. A few will sit up, push the cloak aside enough to let the cold shock their chest awake, and then take a drink of water in 2 measured swallows before lying down. Again. The water makes a hollow glug in the skin as air displaces it. A man taps a skin lightly to hear how much remains, not because he intends to drink more, but because he wants to know whether a refill is needed at dawn. Such practical curiosities reassert order over the brain's fog. On the perimeter, the dogs are more likely to stir in this watch. They rotate on their bedding of straw and cloth, and the chain gives a brief, dull clink. One might snuff at the air with a sound like a muffled sneeze, then tuck nose under paw to preserve warmth. Animals do not waste motion at night if they have learned the rhythms of the camp, and these dogs have. Their signal to the men on watch is neither a bark nor a whine, but their stillness or sudden attention. You can hear the change in their breathing first, a quicker pattern that precedes any other sign. The sentry who hears it glances and confirms with his own eyes what the dog's ears and nose have told him. This is an unrecorded partnership, but the sounds of it are as coded to you as the notes of a horn. The third watch is also when the men responsible for the granary and the stores check their places with minimum fuss. A latch is lifted, an interior door that sticks slightly in dry weather is persuaded to move with a familiar push. The padded tread of sandals on timber floors that are kept high to deter damp and vermin. They do not disturb anything unless necessary. They listen as much as they listen for the rustle that should not be there, for the small scurry that betrays a gap seal that has loosened. If a trap is sprung, its sound is a neat snap, and a problem becomes maintenance rather than anxiety. The store's keepers are the least dramatic of men, and their night checks are the least dramatic of acts, and yet the sound of their rounds is one you would miss if it vanished. It would mean neglect had crept in a heavier sound than any rat in this period. 2. You might hear the faint religious murmurs of those who choose to mark the cold hours with a whispered prayer. The words are ordinary and spare, the same phrases repeated so often that their meaning sits less in their content than in the act of speaking them. A small charm's bead clicks against another as a string is turned in fingers. A small image of a household god carried in a pouch is touched with the nail of a thumb and then set down. These sounds are not made for others to hear, but sound does not obey intention. It carries light as breath, and the men who happen to hear do not comment. The camp has a place for quiet that manifests in different ways for different men. What matters is that the quiet remains disciplined, and that its existence reminds each listener that he lives in a structure of meaning that includes his own purposes. Sometimes, less common, but not rare, the third watch will bring a genuine alert. The horn lifts slightly above its usual register, the note held longer, and the sound is the agreed sign for stand to, without shouting alarm. The camp does not explode into motion. It firms. Hands find straps. Feet find boots. Men move to posts. They can reach in darkness without a lantern, because to need light is to demonstrate inattention. The watchers at the gate become two more watchers on the rampart, not because there is suddenly danger at the gate, but because a possible approach would use the blind points anywhere else. The searchers look beyond the ditch and hear, if they are to hear anything, the difference between wind through scrub and a man's weight breaking a twig. If no confirming sound follows no scrape again, no second rustle in the same pattern, the camp lets the tension drain away. In an army that survives, tension is not a constant state, but a resource to be applied and then conserved. Your ear learns to recognize the after of such moments as much as the moments themselves. The return to baseline has a relief in it, but not a slackness. The men at the end of the perimeter exchange a few phrases to mark the return. Their voices are slightly lighter, almost amused, not at danger averted, but at having once again practiced for the thing that did not happen. The steps regain their pace. The dogs settle again. The horn's echo dies into the empty spaces between tents and earthworks. And then those spaces repopulate with the smaller noises that are the camp's free breathing. As the third watch runs toward its end, you begin to hear the world beyond the camp, the world that did not conform to your day, begin to stir. Somewhere at a distance, a farm's fowl might make a tentative sound. Not a full crow, not yet, but one of those uncertain notes that mark a bird's adjustment on a perch. Farther still, you might detect the hollow thud of water in a vessel as someone in a hut or village moves it closer to the hearth. These are peripheral sounds, often masked by wind or by the camp's own sounds, but when they come through, they are oddly reassuring. They say, the night is finite. They say, the night commits to ending with the same fidelity with which it began. The rhythm of changing watches is its own sound now, and the end of the third brings more than one set of footfalls. It brings the low, businesslike words of men, making sure they are relieving and being relieved in equal measure. The watchword is repeated one more time, more a greeting now than a test, because any enemy close enough to hear would also be close enough to see. The men coming off the rampart stamp their feet and rub their hands together. The slight rasp of skin against skin, a crisp counterpoint to the softer sounds of sleep they are about to join. Those taking their place adjust their cloaks, set their stances, and settle into the rhythms that you have been hearing all night. Nothing here is new, and yet everything here is fresh because it belongs exactly to this particular night, with this particular temperature, this particular set of small noises that will never again appear exactly in this arrangement. The fourth watch enters with its own premonition of dawn. The sky may not yet show light, but the air admits the possibility of it. The dogs sense it first, perhaps, rising and stretching with that long back curve that ends in a shake that jingles chain, then dropping their heads to their paws again with evident relief. the men sense it next. They stand a fraction straighter, as if the body's clock recognizes a familiar threshold. The camp's center answers with a single soft stir, someone tending the main fire to coax a flame from the banked bed. A careful lift of ash, a small breath blown to encourage a flicker. The sound of those actions is tiny but immensely significant. It is the sound that says, "We are moving toward the day." If this were a permanent camp with a water clock, you might hear the soft drip within the timekeeper's pot as the last measures of the night move across the scale. In a marching camp, time is more often counted by habit and by sky. Nonetheless, someone keeps the internal count, and the signal to begin rousing does not come late. The horn gives its brief, low note to alert, not alarm. Men in the tents begin their own routines with the same unremarkable efficiency they used at dusk. There is the slide and rustle of cloaks being folded, the low grunt as a man sits up against stiffness, the sound of buckles and straps moving back to where they belong. The hand mill begins again in a few places, its stone song now a little more lively as hunger returns from sleep. The latrines beyond the perimeter are visited by men in pairs by habit, and the path there and back is marked by soft footfalls and the mutual interchange of a few good-natured words that respect the night's lingering quiet. The camp dogs prick their ears at the first unambiguous crow from far off and then ignore it, because it is a sound that belongs to the world and not to their duties. The horses, if present with the unit, stamp and shake to signal their own readiness to be checked, and the handlers come with brushes and rags, their whispers in the animal's ears indistinguishable from the rhythm of the grooming itself. The iron in the hobnails clicks a little brighter now as steps grow more confident. The third watch has done its work. The fourth now builds the bridge to morning, not with shouts, but with layered, ordinary noises. And as the first light comes, as coals turn from the dull red of concealment to the warm orange of use, as the breath of men and animals white in the air begins to thin and then vanish, you listen to what remains of the night and ask yourself the simplest question that the camp always puts to you at this hour. How many of these ordinary sounds, footfall, cough, breath, whisper, crackle, were the true walls and gates that kept you safe? And how much of what you call security is simply the habit of having heard them in the same order so many times that you no longer wonder which is the most important? You come in from the palisade walk at last light, and the sound that meets you is not the urgent building of a marching camp, but the steady, familiar murmur of a permanent place that has learned to receive the dark without hurry. In a fortress, the size of a small town, the evening changes tone in layers. First, along the rampart, you hear the last of the day's orders carried like a low echo under the timber walkways, boots on planks, the soft thud as a hand rests on a post while a man takes the next step down, iron fixings giving a brief click when weight comes off them. Then, in the streets inside the walls, the sound shifts to household preparations within a military order. Door bars lift and fall as contubernia tidy their quarters, lids settle on storage jars, and the furnace rooms of the baths breathe a slow, steady heat that began in the afternoon and will last until well past midnight. You can plot your route by these domestic pulses. The Via Principalis carries footsteps with a hollow resonance where its stone blocks bridge culverts, while the side lanes damp sound with compacted earth and the soft rugs of straw outside doorways. You feel, more than hear, the fortress relax into the shape it takes each evening. A place that expects the night and has places ready for it. The long barracks rooms hum with the small chores that fill the interval between evening meal and lights banked. You can trace the rows of them by the repeated pattern. A small scrape as a bench is shifted closer to the brazier, the squeal of a leather strap being pulled through its slit and then greased with a thumb's worth of oil, the tap-tap of hobnails checked along a sole, the quieter whisper as a rough cloth dampened and wrung. runs along a scabbard or helmet rim to take off salt and grime. Men call out to each other without needing to raise their voices. The names drift like the steam from cooking pots. The same names every night. In the same short bursts, names that find their way across a corridor because they have been thrown. So many times that their arc is perfect. A centurion passes and is noted not by shouted greeting, but by that reflexive shuffle toward neatness, the cloak pulled straight on the peg. The bedroll squared accompanied by the soft scuff of sandals. Realigning on the threshold, you turn past the workshops. The fabrica, where iron and leather have their own evening register. The forges are still, coals swept and covered so they will be ready to take flame quickly in the morning. In this pause, you can hear the breath of the place and other materials. The faint creak as wooden forms release a day's warmth back to the air, the leathery sigh of a stretched hide as it cools. A row of harness buckles clinking gently together when a draft sneaks under the door. A junior smith, not yet allowed to leave a blade to cool without checking it, lifts a wrapped tool and sets it down again, listening to the minute tick as metal contracts. He makes a note in his head, not aloud, for tomorrow's finish. It is a sound no one else would trouble to hear, and that is the point. In a fortress like this, the night belongs to the disciplines that can operate quietly near the granaries. The horia that keep their grains safe from damp and vermin with thick walls and raised floors. You hear the signature of security done right, almost nothing. A latch, oiled and checked, closes with a soft kiss of wood. A pair of keys knock once against each other inside a leather pouch and then fall silent as the pouch settles against a belt. The guards posted there do not stand still. They walk their short beat in steady steps, and the soles of their shoes announce their passage at intervals exact enough to time the relaxation of the men inside the neighboring barracks, who have learned to sleep with a sense of when the next footfalls will come. If that rhythm changed, if silence extended too long or came too often, ears would prick and someone would rise without needing to be told. This sensitivity is not a burden. It is a kind of luxury of competence. You live in a place where routine and attention have made each sound honest at the Principia, the headquarters building. You pass into a cooler, wider space where voices have a different quality. There, the clerk's stylus makes its dry, precise scratches on wax tablets. The sound is unlovely, but satisfying. A steady burr like a wasp behind a wall, and you know exactly what it means. Inventories tallied, watch lists set, a dismissal written and rewritten until the letters sit cleanly. The officer's boots, when they cross the flagged floor, give back a crisp tick that travels under the portico and diffuses into the open courtyard, where the standards rest behind their gates. A guard coughs once, suppresses it, and in the held breath afterward you hear the gate's metal components take up the silence as temperature drops a soft, almost imaginary contraction that those who sleep nearby will tell you is one of their favorite sounds in this place. It means the world is reducing its size to fit the night, and the fortress is the right shape within it. Down by the baths, the evenings are different. You feel it first in the humidity at the doorway, a dampness that lifts, smells, and softens noises. The attendants speak in voices trained to be heard without echoing, and the splash of water against stone has a measured cadence, meaning that the sluices are being cleared. The ash raked out, the tools for tomorrow stacked where they must be. In a fortress where you would expect discipline to find its expression in marching steps and shouted orders, you should not be surprised that bathhouse discipline announces itself in a barely audible choreography. A bucket set down, a brush shaken, free of water, the gentle clank of a chain that controls a drain. The men leave in pairs and small groups, rubbing hair with cloths that whisper. And their laughter, it happens, is narrow, more like an exhale with shape than a sound that could bounce off stone. As you pass, A puff of heated air follows. You out, smelling faintly of lime and oil. And that smell becomes a private marker on the map of your night. The animal lines lie. Quiet, except for an occasional hoof stamp and the wet chuff of breath from a nostril. The mules know this place as well as the men do. Their ears pivot at small sounds and then ease back as they recognize familiar footsteps. Their harness hangs just near enough to hand that you could tack them quickly if ordered, and the buckles. When they move, touch each other with tiny metallic kisses. The stable hands move among them with pads of footfall you would not notice unless you were listening for them. A soft curse, muffled by a sleeve as a strap catches. A bucket drawn, a little closer with a low scrape. A blanket shaken out once, then settled. If you paused long in this damp and animal-warm corner of the fortress, you might doze. Not because you lack sleep, but because these sounds have set a rhythm you know to be safe beyond the granary courts. The storehouses for tools and tenting. The amphory of oil and wine stacked nose to tail. The scent changes, and so does the character of sound. Clay and oil dull the air, and fabric becomes more present. Bales of cloth, spares for sails, tent panels. Replacement cloak siege stack sings its quiet into the area. A faint fuzz when a hand slides. The muted thump when a bolt is set down neatly. The men who tend this inventory count in whispers, not because anyone demands it at this hour, but because counting in whispers keeps you from losing your place. The tally marks are scratched on tablets that complain softly under the stylus point. And you can, if you stand long enough, hear the minute crackling of dried sap in the wood of the roof beams as evening cool takes hold. These are the sounds that make you keenly aware that this fortress is wood and stone, leather and iron, flesh and breath, all different registers in the orchestra of an imposed order. Along the wall walks, you'll hear speech in another register, short exchanges between. Sentries that cover procedures too dull to talk about in daylight. Which line of sight is bad in moonlight because a branch outside the wall loses leaves at an angle that deceives you into thinking movement is there? Which square on the field beyond floods first when rain comes, sending a frog chorus up so loud that it masks footsteps? Which section of walkway will start to groan under a certain weight if the plank has loosened? The men mutter these things to one another as they change places, information soldered to habit with a thin flow of words. If you did not know what to hear for, you might think they spoke of inconsequence. You would be wrong. This is how a border place identifies threats long before it hears them. The less glamorous corners of the fortress make night of their own. The latrines, set beyond the inner lines where the flow of water carries waste away from living spaces, are visited by men who have learned the virtues of the buddy system without needing the word for it. You hear pairs pass and return, 2 sets of steps leaving, 2 sets returning, a brief murmur that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with courtesy. On the path there and back, gravel pops underfoot in small, regular notes, and someone, at some point, will always step in the same shallow depression the same way, producing the same hollow sound that you would know if you heard it with your eyes closed. This repetition is not boredom. It is the construction of safety out of detail. Not all spaces are filled in the evening. The amphitheater, if this fortress has one close by, sits quiet and shallow under the sky like a basin designed to collect the last light. There, the night comes on with a wider sound, wind across turf, the faint shifting of small animals, the distant brush of a branch. You might think this openness invites noise, but in truth, it disciplines it. You cannot hear yourself as separate in a place like that. In contrast, within the medical quarters, the valetudinarium, there is a different kind of restraint. The sick and wounded settle uneasily into whatever comfort they can claim. You hear splints adjusted, a jug tapped gently to distribute sediment. Before a dose is poured, fabric moved with care around a tender spot. The medic's footsteps are unhurried, and each stop is longer than it would be in daylight, when pressure comes from every direction. Evening allows attention to collapse into single tasks. The sound of healing is patient. As fully dark settles, the fortress takes its final shape. The horn that marks the first watch is modest. In a place like this, you do not need to blow loud to dominate an empty landscape. The note calls more than it commands. Men know their places. The gates receive their additional bars with a subdued thud. The watch commanders move along established routes. Their presence advertised only by slightly brisker footfalls and the predictable pause at each post long enough to prove that listening is the main act. You feel the night yoke itself to thee. Fortress, and the fortress accept it, and the comfort you find in that is not aesthetic. It is the comfort of experience shared out across many shoulders and made into a fabric. You ask yourself what the fortress would sound like if it did not lie where it does, along a river that carries damp and fish and reed sounds with it. Would a fortress in a dry land at this hour have this soft hiss rising from its low places? Would the boards above the culverts hold this hollow oath in their mouths? Or would some other set of routine noises take that place in the night map, providing a different kind of reassurance that only the men who live there would understand? The second watch in a winter fortress settles more deeply than any quiet in a marching camp can. Here, the quiet is not an absence but an equilibrium, and your ears learn to hold it in pieces. Along the rampart, men pace in pairs or singly. There, steps matched not to any shouted cadence, but to a rhythm that keeps blood moving without inviting complacency. The timber underfoot answers with a note that tells you whether the frost has come. On cold nights, the plank speaks shorter and higher, a faint, dry crack with each settle. On milder nights, the sound is older and rounder, as if absorbed by softness in the wood. You hear the same detail in the leather of belts and scabbards. The colder it is, the sharper the small complaint when a strap takes a new angle. The warmer, the more those noises turn into a background whisper that your mind stops parsing. The administrative heart of the fortress works later than many would expect, and you learn its noises like a second language. The clerk who copies orders does so with a stylus that clicks infinitesimally at the end of each letter when lifted from wax. That click, faint as it is, repeats until it becomes the steady measure by which the nearby guard unconsciously times his scan from left to right across the entrance court. In another room, a tally of rations is confirmed with small marks you cannot see. Only infer from the way the tablet is turned, one edge rubbed by a thumb, the surface set flat, the stylus laid diagonally in the groove to rest while a figure is checked. The officer who approves the totals exhales through his nose in short puffs, a habit of thought that his men could mimic if asked, because they have heard it at this hour enough times to have made it part of the place's voice. The baths, by now, breathe less loudly, but they do not fall silent. A furnace tender pokes through the ash to make sure embers remain, and the rod scrapes stone with a sound like a throat being cleared in another room. He closes the door and swings the latch. Down in the rhythm of a man who has counted that motion into the way he marks time between rounds. Water in the settling tank emits a single hollow plop when a bubble breaks free from somewhere deep. And you think for no useful reason that this is the sound of the day's labor lowering itself onto the floor to sleep. Two men pass under the portico and exchange a friendly insult in tones so low they could be chanting a prayer. Their laughter is no more than breath finding a shape that, if you could see it, would rise and drift apart before it reached the central courtyard. In the barracks, the second watch belongs to the one or two who cannot yet sleep and to the one who must not. The man on interior duty checks the brazier. If it needs turning, he uses a poker wrapped in cloth to mute the clink of charcoal. The lifting and settling of the lid on the grain pot kept overnight near the heat so the morning meal starts quicker. has its own courtesy, set down at an angle and then rotated to seat gently rather than dropped. He moves from door to door with an even step, neither stealthy nor loud. Because the men in the rooms mark his presence as proof that the interior of the world is under watch as surely as the exterior. The man who reties a strap does not apologize. He works slowly enough that the leather squeak never rises into complaint. He sets the buckle tongue with a certainty that denies the possibility of error. Sleep resumes around him because he has made the noise of competence, and that is its own lullaby. In the granary ward, there is no sound most of the time, but the quiet has edges. On one of the colder nights, you can hear the river's voice under the fortress walls if you hold your breath. It is a big sound heard small, a muscular shushing that finds corners to curl into. That sound tells you as much about the line you hold as any boundary marker. It says, beyond here, boats move even in winter, and bargemen cough into their scarves, and keep going. It says, this fortress stores what keeps those boats and those men moving. The few rats that test the gates of the granaries are betrayed by their own boldness. One makes the mistake of leaping from a beam to a sack and leaves. A noise where none should be a dull thud, followed by a skitter. The keeper, who knows which noises belong to the second watch and which do not, appears with a quickness that makes no hurry sound, and the trap's snap is neat, decisive, without the shouted flourish that daytime wastefully invites. A different kind of hearing develops in the guardrooms near the gates. Men practice it without deciding to. They listen for language. On some nights, it approaches from the dark, a word in a tongue that is not Latin spoken between travelers. An epithet tossed by a boatman to another, a name of a dog called in a dialect you recognize but cannot speak, cannot make out content. Only tone, but tone will do. A certain tone means routine, another means drink, another means worry that could break into something more. The guards do not report tone to their superiors. There is no place on a tablet to note mood. And yet the guards return to their posts, thinking to themselves, privately, without boasting that they have done the first part of good watchfulness. They have placed the world beyond the gate in a frame and seen that it is no immediate threat. To the frame, the fortress's dogs keep a different watch than in a marching camp. Their familiarity with the place makes them sparing with sound. A dog facing outward will alert to a fox as easily as to a man, but it will tell the difference before any human ear could. The change in its breathing means one thing. The alignment of its body means another. The short rumble it keeps in its chest is for men inside the gate to hear without waking the men 3 buildings away. The handler, if awake, answers not with a hush, but with a long, slow exhale audible at short range. And the dog takes that as permission to hold, to watch, to let the night resume its usual pattern. This, you realize, is how partnership sounds when it is old. 2 beings who have practiced the same decision enough times to have made a single sound out of it. Elsewhere, you can hear the fortress register weather without needing your eyes. Snow that sometimes comes to a river fortress doesn't arrive with the dramatics of rain. It comes as a thicker silence first, then the tight, swiftly repeated patter of flakes on cloak and timber. The first flakes do not stick, and the wetted sound of them on wood is different from their later settled hush on accumulated snow. Sentries adjust cloaks, and you hear the coarse wool rasp against itself when a man pulls more of it around his neck. The steadying of hands on spear shafts brings a flock of small noises, the faint zip of cloth over smooth wood, the squeak of leather moving against leather. A man who does not notice such changes in the sound map misses the first hour of a weather shift and then goes cold more quickly. You have learned not to make that mistake. In the little sanctuaries tucked within the fortress, those quiet niches where household gods or adopted local spirits receive their offerings, you hear the very least of the night. A man lights a pinch of incense and the powder falls with a soft, dry hiss on the hot plate. If a second pinches some of the ash between his fingers, the grains make a whisper on skin, like a word he cannot quite pronounce. There is no chorus, no congregational voice. The fortress in the second watch is too busy being itself to make room for grand worship. But you know the sound of individual devotion when it is near, and you do not confuse it with distraction. The two men who take turns in this place in the night return to their beds afterward without fanfare. And if sleep comes easier because their ears have heard the tiny noise of offering, then that, too, is part of the fortress doing its work. There are disturbances even here. A messenger might come late, leaving the river road with a horse that throws its sound back at the walls in a rhythm every man near a gate understands. Hoof on frozen ground rings sharp. Hoof on soil softened under many feet thuds, muffled. When the messenger arrives, the exchanges are minimal. Challenge, reply. A short rule set played through in words like counters moved on a board. The horse breathes hard and shakes its head, the bridle giving a tidy clank. And then it calms under a hand on the nose and a patted neck. The gates? Bar is set back into place with that same well-practiced tone you recognized earlier. A kind of closing that sounds neither final nor reluctant. The fortress accepts the event, digests it, and returns to baseline, which is exactly what you want a place to do that has responsibility for wide stretches of quiet. When the hour runs long and the second watch leans toward the third. Fatigue is not the enemy, it is in a marching camp. In a fortress, fatigue spreads into the architecture, and the building absorbs some of it. You hear it in the way footsteps get slightly heavier, and then lighten again when they cross door thresholds, and the thresholds themselves remind legs. How to lift cleanly. You hear it in the way a man pauses at a window slit for one extra heartbeat before moving on. The stone edge telling him there is a place in the world that will not move whether or not he does. The habit of a permanent place is to provide such small, audible angles that pull the body back into its best lines, as the horn for the third. Watch rises into the air, not any louder than the earlier notes, just differently shaped you. Catch yourself thinking that the distinction between second and third is not one of sound so much as one of expectation. The second watch promises preservation. The third promises pressure. You wonder, as the men change places with the curt economy that convinces you this will happen on time until the fortress stands no more, whether the third watch is colder. Hours will bring any deviation from the pattern you learned tonight, or whether, once again, the deepest part of darkness will prove that the ordinary has the longest reach. The third watch begins with a bracing in of the body and a narrowing of the mind. You feel it in your jaw, in the way you set your teeth not against danger, but against the small, sneaking discomforts that steal attention. A stiff finger, a chill working down the back beneath the collar, the impulse to yawn that you arrest. By swallowing hard, the soundscape answers accordingly. Boots stamp a fraction more firmly on the timber walks by the wall. The echo of those stamps returns with a higher bite, because cold turns every surface a little more glass-like. The thrust of a hand deeper into a cloak produces a dry rasp as coarse wool abrades the knuckles. Spear, but set down between paces. On the walkway leaves a neat thock in exactly the same place it made the same mark an hour before. And this repetition persuades you that the line will hold simply because men are doing exactly what men did yesterday, under that regularity. Other sounds make themselves known. Breath is audible now, not in gasps, but in steady clouded measures that pair with steps. The dogs move less. Their chains deliver one or two short, dull chinks and then lie still again, because beasts with sense conserve heat as carefully as men do. Somewhere in the inner court of the Principia, a shutter shivers when a draft slips along the masonry and finds the one gap not fully packed with wool or clay. That tiny rattle tells you the building is not purely stone. It is a maid, thing contending rightly with air and season. In the barracks, a sleeper rolls, and his weight makes the plank bed groan low. Not in complaint, but in a voice that says wood insists on being wood, even in a place where men ask it to be order. You move your listening inward, toward the corners, where work persists. The night officer makes his rounds within the Principia. His sandal soles treat the flagstones of the internal aisles with equal weight, never hurrying between doorways. He pauses at each threshold. More than any words is the mark of competence, and you can time that pause if you are paying attention. Enough to hear that a brazier breathes steadily, enough to detect if the clerk's stylus strokes have ceased and the tablet lies face down to preserve a calculation for morning. At one doorway he hears a cough hitch, and he lingers a breath longer and then moves on, knowing the medic will visit of his own accord if the hitch repeats. The fortress's chain of care tightens without clanking. Bread is prepared in some barracks at this hour so that it can be baked at first light, and the sound of a small quern grinding is the heartbeat of such preparations. The millstone's voice is gravel soft. A double tone the upper stones wait on the lower, the grain itself giving way that repeats without complaint. Between turns, the woman or the soldier assigned lifts the stone and brushes a palmful of meal into a bowl. The bowl speaks clay as clearly as any tile, a low rounded tap when set down. This is not a romantic sound, but in the third watch it says, "You will eat. Your body will be ready." The fortress provides continuity even when the river freezes at the margins and cracks like pottery when the sun touches it dot at the gates. Exchanges are rarer and so gain meaning when they happen. Sometimes a boatman calls late, and the watch answers with the closest thing to a courtesy protocol the night. Allows a call, a reply, and then the sound of a bar lifted and replaced or left unmoved, depending on whether entry is permitted. These sequences have been refined by repetition until they waste nothing. The gate's machinery has learned to make the least noise possible, consistent with strength. The massive timbers do not creak when treated, and the ironwork engaged too. Secure them knocks against the plates with a tone as controlled as the speech nearby. It is in these economies that you hear the fortress's intelligence. Distributed and modest, exercised not in grand gestures, but in the steady practice of not exciting the night. Weather has its own dialogue in these hours. On a clear winter night, frost forms on the inside of shutters and makes a faint glittering sound when flakes loosen and fall to a sill. If you draw a finger across the wood, you hear a ragged squeak, unpleasant to some, pleasing to others for the same reason, because it means conditions are crisp and dry, and walking the wall will be sure-footed. If snow begins, the sound changes quickly. It muffles. It pulls the top out of noises the way. A hand on a drumhead deadens resonance. The first minutes of snow are the strangest because your ear, trained for echoes, suddenly loses them. You stamp once, hear only the near part of your own footfall, and understand in a body-deep way that each movement now demands a slight recalibration. Men adjust not only their pace, but their listening. The fortress under snow is the same fortress. It is simply a quieter version, and you have to stretch your hearing farther to touch what you usually touch with less effort. You think of the outer world. That thought has a sound too. On the other side of the river, a small village returns to itself after the day. In the third watch, a child may cry, and that sound will carry differently across water. Not like a human voice, but like a reed pipe. A door may shut with a clap. That, in this air, rings like a struck plank. You are not supervising those noises. They are not your charge. But they join the mental atlas you keep, and you update it with such inputs without needing to say so. If one night no such noises arise when they usually do, you will notice, and you will adjust your alertness around that lack. Sometimes absence talks louder than presence. A fortress has a chapel, or at least a standard shrine, And here, toward morning, one or two men choose to mark the hour before dawn. Their sandals whisper on the swept floor. A small lamp makes a noise like a breath. When its wick is pinched free of a bubble of air and takes oil cleanly again. The man does not pray in elaborate words. He likely repeats a phrase whose edges the ear cannot catch. The clack of a wooden token set down to mark a vow made becomes the only sound that has shape. In a marching camp, this restraint might feel forced. In the fortress, it feels fitted, as if the building had been waiting quietly all night to receive exactly this kind of noise at exactly this time. With dawn approaching, the bakery rooms begin to stir openly. The first paddle onto the oven floor scrapes with a utilitarian grace. Bread set down makes a bluff, friendly thump that says a day will be started with something warm in the hand. The lid of a pot is lifted and set on a clean surface with a restraint that betrays long practice. These are the practical sounds of comfort in a place that does not indulge comfort for its own sake. In a winter fortress, calories are strategy. The quiet here is not a denial of joy. It is the discipline that makes permitted joy durable. The relief of the watch approaches. You can hear it not because men become louder, but because they become more intentional. Boots tighten. Belts are adjusted. The watchword, held like a coin all night, is spent one last time in the exchange that transfers responsibility from one body to another. The words are dull by design and satisfying for the same reason. Men greet the replacements with the business-like courtesy of those who share a craft. They do not linger. They do not hurry. They leave behind a rampart that will sound exactly as it did when they arrived. And that is the point, the whole point, the only point that matters. The horn that touches the air at the end of the third watch is low and brief. It does not claim the morning, it acknowledges it. The fortress answers with its thousand small routines rising, not as a chorus, but as a growing field of individual notes. The animal lions wake. Hooves stamp. Harness rattles in place. The hammers in the workshop will ring louder soon, but now you hear the preparatory noises, the placing of tools, the testing of edges, the setting out of rivets in a sequence that the worker could follow blind. In the Principia, the clerks pull breath into their chests for a daylight's worth of tallying. And even that breath sounds different after a night spent in narrow exhalations. If you stand and listen at this threshold, be between deepest night and just before morning, you can think of 1,000 things that might change the day, a message that turns preparation into movement. A flood that fills culverts and makes the main road impassable. A shipment late by a day that will require someone to shave rations. None of those hypothetical noises are present yet. What you hear instead is the fortress doing the honest work of being ready. And that raises the quietest question a winter night can ask, of all the ordinary sounds you have counted and trusted, which will prove, by the time darkness comes again, to have been the hinge on which the day turned. And will you know it when you hear it next time? You come to the little fort in the late sun, when the sandstone seems to hold light as if it were a liquid sealed in pores. The heat lifts off the rampart slowly, radiating from parapet blocks and the wooden lintels above the gate, and you hear the desert before you see the garrison in motion. Wind licks along the wall in dry strokes, a faint rasp carrying grains of sand that hiss where they meet stone. Hooves have long since fallen quiet outside. What you hear now are feet sandals. On tamped earth, deliberate and unhurried match to the measured routines of a place that knows its night. There are no grand preparations here, only the careful settling of everything into its prescribed place. Within minutes, you can name the parts by their sounds. Bucket lifting water from a cistern groans with a rope's twist. Amphora sealed and tested with a thumb makes a hollow pop against its stopper. Gate bar slotted up enough to breathe and then down again with a subdued thud that avoids echo. You move through a courtyard small enough that the cough in one corner travels to your ear as a whisper of dust in another. and every sound is accounted for. Parceled into necessity. The first watch in a desert outpost begins before true dark, because night in the open is a slide rather than a drop. Men at the parapet trade the brightness of day for the neutrality of twilight, letting their eyes adjust so they do not mistake the lingering heat shimmers for movement. They talk low, and their words are utilitarian. The wind is wrong for sand. To lift, the jackals are out early to the south, so the wadi holds water somewhere. You take notes with your ears in the same way, sorting the world by what it asks of you. Canvas awning over the little bakery pitches as wind finds the slack, its wooden uprights answering with a tired creak. That sound tells you the rise in wind is routine, not an omen of a dust storm. The baker clears his throat and knocks flour from his hands against a post with two soft raps. You hear the powder fall like a sigh and settle into a shallow footprint. The outpost is so small that this detail feels like a district hand that is the trick desert places play. They teach you that a single sound can be a neighborhood if it repeats in a dependable way. You learn the animals first, because they are a language of their own. Camels in the pen breathe like leather bellows, long exhale that ends in a brief grunt when a weight shifts. Their knee pads scrape dry earth with a coarse brush sound as they kneel. The straps at their noses from halters, made for them by men who learn to follow the contours of Bone Creek in a voice different from mule harness. A donkey makes a throat noise that never resolves into a bray at this hour. Its handler has taught it a night tone with patience and routine. You know where you are in the fort by the animal's breathing tempo. Close to the water troughs, the breaths add damp to the air. Near the outer wall, the breaths run a fraction cooler and pick up the edge of wind grating along stone. In the barracks room, you can call a single long chamber by that name. You listen to the desert teach a different discipline. Everything that can rattle has been taught not to. Shields lean with leather edges against plastered wall, so iron bosses do not kiss stone and announce themselves. Scabbards hang in pairs, and a twist of cloth is tucked between them so they do not clink in minor chords when the door shifts. The men's bedrolls lie where the day's heat left them. And when bodies settle, the straw inside makes a faint crunch. A sound you could mistake for a lizard crossing the threshold if you did not know better. It becomes one more number in the sum you keep unconsciously in your head, a quiet that has not been forced. Only tuned from the inner corner of the yard, the signal horn gives a note pitched for closeness rather than distance. It is low, almost reluctant, and it passes along the walls like a hand along a rope. You count time by these notes until you stop counting and merely recognize their place in the night. First watch does not only mean eyes outward, it means hands inward, too. The little tasks that turn daylight sweat into nighttime's readiness. The water skins are tested with a squeeze and a listen the soft crumple that assures you the leather has not gone brittle in the heat. A man weights a rag and wipes a helmet rim, and the water hisses on metal still warm. Another needs a strip of rawhide that went stiff, working it with fingers in small circles that make a sound like someone rubbing a flat stone. This is the sound of tomorrow's comfort paid for with tonight's minute of patience. The desert belongs to small animals when the light goes. You hear them before you accept that they are not men. A scuttling begins in the low brush outside the wall. Your ears put it at man-knee height, but your practice corrects you immediately. The rhythm is wrong. Quick, quick pause. Quick, quick. A gecko makes a clicking with its mouth and feet. A fox calls with an upward yip from a sandy slope you cannot see. Once, a hedgehog snorts at nothing as it blunders into a dried plant, and the sentry on that side smiles with his breath under his cloak, because it is one of the night's familiar jokes. The dog on the rampart, long-legged ears, high ears. All this first and interprets it for you with the economy of a head tilt. He will growl at nothing, because here nothing could be a man moving slowly. But his growl for nothing is not the same as the tucked-in rumble he keeps for something that wants to be nothing. When night fully takes, darkness tastes like stone dust. Your tongue knows it, and your ear hears it in the way words lose their moisture. Men on watch speak in shorter syllables, not clipped by discipline alone, but by the way the dry air takes. The edges from long sounds and returns them harsh. The wind has dropped. You can hear that by the absence of hiss along the wall. In place of the wind comes the louder breathing of the desert's cool. It rises from the ground under your feet and carries the memory of sun away. The walls give back tiny reports as their heat left them a tick here, a tick there. The gate would contract with soft crackles that seem at first like a disrespectful answer to the care taken in oiling hinges. But no oil prevents wood from being wood. You know this and take comfort in a structure that declares its nature honestly. The watchword, a simple, drab word as always, belongs to the circuit now. It moves along the line in breaths, not voices. One man gives it to the next, as if passing a coin, a handoff that the desert devours as it devours footprints by morning. You can hear the intention more than the tona careful leaning of sound, toward a single ear that hears and nods and closes lips again. These are the noises you would miss in a town where a tavern's music and a market's bargaining fill the night.
Here?
They form the anatomy of reassurance, the light knock of knuckles on a parapet stone to announce a patrol's approach, the answering tap 2 stones over, the silence that follows as the men take their place and resume listening to the world outside. Inside the gate, a little shrine nestles in the wall's shadow. The offering is not loud. Desert places do not tolerate sound wasted on demonstration. The grain falls from a pinch between fingers with a dry tinkle into the little basin, an economy so rigid that even piety frays its edges to fit. The words whispered over it are less than words now, merely breath-shaped, so the man making them sound can convince himself he offers something more than a gesture to habit. You catch none of it, only the tiny motion of palm over brow-shoulder. Chest a soundless arc of loyalty to a pattern older than the outposta. Pattern that keeps minds quiet when the night tries to press them outward into featureless space. There is work at the cistern. The pulley rope makes its groan at the top of the lift, then relaxes with a long breath that the stone mouth gives back to the air in a soft echo. Water meets water in a deeper sound that belongs to the geometry of the shaft. A guard on the near wall listens and measures the interval between fills, tells himself that the rhythm means no one is wasting what must be rationed daily. He thinks of the account kept in a tablet inside, scratches representing swallows, and he adjusts nothing because the sound tells him nothing needs adjusting. This is how you know an outpost is healthy at night. Sounds confirm decisions already made. Not go new ones at a time when choices turn clumsy in the dark. On the far side, beyond the shadow thrown by the parapet, something larger moves, and the whole night inhales. The rustle is wrong for fox or hedgehog, too heavy, too calm. The sentry's spear tip settles without a click against stone, his body shifting weight to the balls of his feet. You watch the dog more than you watch the darkness. Its ears do a small dance, locating angles the human head cannot. 1 breath, 2. 3. The figure at last reveals itself, not by sound, but by lack of it, where you expect more. A lone man would make more noise, caught in brush. A small group would talk. What passes is a camel string in the hands of men who know silence like they know the taste of dust. Their progress is a cord of soft pads on sand, so distributed that it feels like a wind moving at knee height. They are not your concern tonight. They skirt the fort as if it were a thorn bush and disappear along a pale line that is nothing but the memory of a road. Your ears relax in the careful way trained ears relax. The spear does not lift. but the hand smooths the shaft as if it were the mane of an obedient animal. Inside, your tent space holds the day's heat like a kindness, but it breaks apart into pockets, cool and ankle, warm under the arm, as if the air were trying to tell you where you left yourself last noon. A man near the door sleeps already, breath scuffing his throat. Another turns, and the sand under his roll crunches in the quiet, each grain a bead on an abacus you do not use consciously. He is the one who suffers the dry cough triggered by dust. You know the rhythm of it and the length of pause before it resumes. You can tell whether he has woken himself by it or slept through. Tonight he sleeps, and the cough keeps to its lane, smaller than the dog's breath, smaller than the latter's faint complaint as a gust adds weight to it. You think desert nights are made of small agreements between the living and their surroundings. And sound is how those agreements are ratified again and again. The first watch pushes toward its handoff. The horn does not announce time. It confirms. One short note, then a silence during which the replacement feet step from shadow into the parapet's lighter strip. The men relieve each other without ceremony. A word travels both directions. Not the password this time, but a single observation. The wind has a new edge to it. There is a dampness rising from the wad of both, unremarkable and essential. The relieved men descend. The latter talks to muffled squeaks, then none, and then it is only the quiet under a sky made of salt and stone. You arrange your cloak and place one hand under your cheek and feel the grit there and know. You will not sleep without thinking one last sober thought. Will the second watch find a different night in the same place? Or does the desert teach every watch to make identical music out of the same few notes? The second watch inherits a night thinned by cooling and thickened by quiet. The desert has exhausted its heat and replaced it with a measurable chill, and you can hear temperature without a skin's report. Leather yawns in small circles where straps meet buckles. The tension in the gates bar changes pitch when it is tested just once as the new watch settles in. A man pulls his cloak higher, and coarse wool rubs against stubble at his jaw in a whisper that is half scratch, half sigh. The lamp in the little corner where records are kept burns with its smallest flame, fed by oil like a patient given drops by a careful hand. Its wick makes a faint intermittent fizz when a bubble in the oil meets heat. And in that tiny sound, you grasp how serious an outpost must be about fuel. Fire is not a unit of light, but a unit of time. The second watch trusts the geometry it cannot see. The land outside the walls is a low map of silhouettes, and sound gives it contour. The nearest wadi emits that particular nocturnal hush you learn to recognize the muted flow that says, "Water is present without boast." You log the sound and compare it to last night's memory. The difference is a fraction, but differences in desert places own outsized significance. If water rises or recedes, animal traffic shifts with it. If animal traffic shifts, humans are not far behind. The centuries discuss such chain reactions in 7 words. Heads incline toward each other, so voices are under the wind's cap. You hear only their pauses, which are equal in length, indicating the men know one another's thought speeds and have learned not to step on each other's sentences. This, too, is a kind of safety dot within the little fort. Maintenance tasks pass through hands like drowsy birds. A man lifts a water skin and judges by sound and feel how much remains, then hangs it where cooler air will keep it from turning. He sets a pebble at the base of the hook to prevent any sway that could create a tap, tap, tap in the night. Another checks a repair to a saddle tree begun at dusk, pressing the leather to wood so the adhesive binds cleanly. The press has its own tiny note, sticky and short, and he knows from that tone whether he will need to sit on it for another minute. A third runs a claw through the throat of a spear socket to remove sand that could grind metal dull. The cloth emerges with an audible scrape of grit, then gives a cleaner sound on the second pass. He nods to himself in the dark. The nod itself makes no sound, of course, but the absence of a third pass testifies to his satisfaction. This is how a night tells on a unit, by the presence or absence of extra strokes. The outpost's dogs are low talkers in this hour. Their breathing becomes the most dependable metronome in the place. You listen to it and realize it keeps you from counting boots on the parapet to stay awake. When a dog's breath changes, the watch notices before the dogs move. The handler answers not with speech but with posture, standing so the dog can set its head against a thigh for reassurance before resuming that forwardly state that says it is on the clock. The partnership needs no more sound than breath and weight. You think of the similar way the wind interacts with the wall, lifting at corners, easing over the parapet where the capstones are smoother, turning eddies in the lee of the towers. Sound plays these surfaces like a crude instrument, and the men who live here can tell whether a capstone has loosened by the slight change in the wind's note at that point. Some nights, the caravan approaches close enough that its size writes itself in your ear. 5 animals become 10 the moment you hear not just footfalls, but the cadence of packs groaning. 10 becomes 15 when the second human voice answers a first, and then 3 or 4 more reply in overlapping rounds of assurance to beasts and men both, if they are wise and honest. The lead man calls softly to the wall and asks the hour, not for the answer which he knows by his own star, but because all commerce in a desert begins with the exchange of ordinary facts. The sentry's reply is short, and the caravan veers away as if they only came near to be certain the fort was awake. The quiet fills back in, almost pliable, like sand smoothing after a lizard passes. Away from the walls, a different work continues. The cistern demands attention even at night because water that stands collects its own hazards. A guard lowers a small lamp to check levels. The lamp's light does not interest you. You are listening for the delicate clink of chain against the shaft, which tells you whether the bucket has scraped where it should not. Scrape would mean sediment disturbed, mean more work in the morning when the water must be drawn through cloth to clear it. The guard lifts without scrape, and the sound that returns is the good sound. The sound of a chain that has passed more links successfully than you care to count. He smiles under his breath, not because the task is fun, but because tonight, this task did not create more tasks. The best sound in a desert outpost is the silence where trouble might have begun. The medic space in an outpost is small, sometimes no more than a chest with folded cloths and small jars. In the second watch, you hear it open. The lid hinges have been wrapped with strip leather to keep them from talking. The mortar under his hand tells of what passes for luxury. A few leaves pounded with a measured tap-tap. To make a poultice for a rash or a sore rubbed raw by grit and strap. The pestle's tone changes as the leaves surrender. It grows duller, and he stops at exactly the right moment so he does not bruise the mixture into bitterness. He does not speak to the man who came to him. He gestures. The man breathes an apology. That is not needed and leaves with a little bowl. You hear the steps fade and imagine the soft rub of paste on skin. The contentment that can be made from simple relief. If there is any singing in a second watch at a desert outpost, it is singular and underbreath, and it carries the cadence of pacing. A man assigns syllables to his circuit 5 to the parapet's length. 1 to the ladder's turn, 3 down the other side. The habit stands between him and drowsiness. He does not choose a song with words anyone would recognize. He chooses the rhythm of his body. After a time, his steps and his breath and his tunelessness braid into a rope that connects points in space the way a line marked in a plan does. If you listen long enough, you could walk his route with your eyes closed. And you do, in your mind, and find yourself mapping as a matter of course. The best nights are like this, a calm set of traversals that renew each other without argument. From beyond the wall, the desert sets a test that is not a threat. A wind rises, not the sand-lifting kind, just a horizontal sweep that flattens brush. You know it by the way the outpost's small flags rags, really set to show wind direction. By habit, begin to flap with short, eager snaps. The wall-top dust skitters in a narrow stream. You hear tiny impacts as grains strike the interface of the parapet. Men tuck their mouths deeper into cloaks to cheat dryness, and conversation ceases entirely, not because there is nothing to say, but because words lose value when the wind eats their edges. You each return to your personal noticings, a loosened peg somewhere singing an unpitched high line until a hand reaches it and rewards the fixing with the good silence. A crack in a post clicking shut as moisture leaves it one more degree. In the barrack space, sleep is not complete. A man sits up and tends a brazier with a single careful stir, so ash does not leap. The coal glows, then draws down into itself, a small red heart under gray. The lid on a pot is tipped to allow a little steam to escape. No more than a breath, so condensation does not collect and rain back. Someone who cannot give up wakefulness counts heartbeats, and you can almost hear counting as the different lengths of inhale and exhale make their own uneven meter. A cough sounds again, the usual one. Now it is looser. The man will improve by morning and get worse by afternoon, and improve again by evening, like most of the minor ailments that ride with dust and discipline. These cycles are what night teaches best. Nothing is only itself. Everything is part of a pattern that has been made livable by repetition. There is one sound that does not belong, metal on stone from beyond the wall. A click not made by animal or wind. The nearest sentry freezes his steps, and the outpost becomes a held breath. The second sound does not come. The first could have been anything: an old ring in the masonry settling, an animal knocking a discarded tool. But the held breath is part of the craft, and it makes its own noise, the soft hum inside the head when you listen too hard. A patrol moves to a less obvious position, the dog's body lengthening into alertness. A whisper passes that is no louder than the scratching of a beetle on a post. The beat holds, then releases when nothing repeats. You learn again that the desert is generous with small deceptions, and the fort's way of receiving them is to stiffen, examine, and then soften. No pride injured by readiness that did not need to be used. The second watch prepares to hand off. The horn leaves one simple footprint in the air. The men coming up the ladder mark their weights differently than those going down. You can tell them apart by steps alone. The watchword goes, hand to hand like a pebble exchanged between fingers. A note again, one sentence tells the relieving pair that the wind has shifted one line east, that it carries a scent of something green. The outpost tucks this information into its chest for later, along with the question it poses to anyone who keeps night here, as the third watch takes the coldest hour and the compass of attention shrinks to stay warm. Will the desert offer a new ask, some small request for adjustment, or will you take the last stretch of dark as a copy of the earlier stretches and risk being wrong by only the width of a single grain of sand? Third watch in the desert pulls your shoulders up before you think to tell them not to. The day's heat is an old story now, and cold rises from the ground like a careful hand feeling for your ankles. You respond with motion measured to the conditions. Steps grow firmer, not faster. Breath is paced to hold warmth, not to squander it on size. The sound map changes to reflect that discipline. Cloaks rasp louder. Canvas, which was slack in heat, tightens and crackles softly where it meets its lashing. The gates bar, challenged. Once and only once at the start of the watch by a warden who refuses habit to turn lazy, answers with a tone half a note higher than in the first watch. A stone at the corner of the parapet ticks as its thin skin sheds the last warmth it held. If you've lived enough desert nights, these are as simple to your ear as the vowels in your own language. The third watch belongs to the men who carry the line through the hour when the body wants to drop. Their conversations, if they happen, are narrower even than in the second watch. A sequence of small questions takes the place of story. Did you hear the soft scratch at the north wall? Yes, and it was the bush that was planted too close by some soldier with a generous hand 5 years ago. Should we move the ladder a width away from the tower now or later? Later, when dawn makes it easier. Did you check the lashings on the awning? Pole. I did, and the knot held. These exchanges make a little framework of reassurance to hang the weight of our on. No one wants to be alone with the wind in their ears for too long. The trick is to be together without making noise for its own sake. The best units get this right without needing to be told how distance brings its own special kind of mistake. In this hour, sounds come farther, and the mind stretches them into shapes. A donkey braying from many hundreds of paces away flattens into something like a horn you might mistake for a human call. You arrest the mistake by locating the sound within a web of other sounds, the line of fox yips that travels between bushes like beads traded between hands. The periodic, almost metronomic clicking of beetles on a wooden trough that has started to split in the cold. You recalibrate, and the mind obliges, returning the donkey to its donkeyness, shrinking the imagined into dimensions that fit the known. You do this without congratulating yourself. Pride is a waste of heat. In the inner yard, bodies make the night bearable for each other with a precise level of care. A man up to tend a brazier pauses to let a sleeping comrade's breath run its course before setting the lid back on a pot to avoid interrupting that rhythm. The lid's soft seat, a dull clay-on-clay sound, is exactly what you want at this hour. Confirmation without intrusion. Another man, on his way to the latrine beyond the small postern, rolls his feet to spare the room from the punctuation of hobnail on hard earth. One small mistake, a dropped spoon tipping from a ledge carries so far that for a moment the entire outpost belongs to that single, bright, metallic note. It is too small to matter, and too big to let pass without a curse breathed through closed teeth. Lesson retaught. Third watch magnifies both attentiveness and error. The records corner includes a water clock in some outposts. Though here, in a place where water is precious, the clock is a light tool of time. If there is one, its drip is the single tender sound remaining to be cataloged. It marks the hour's spine with an evenness you can rely on. When a drip misses, because the little plug of mineral has grown a fraction and slowed the flow, a hand adjusts it with a twist that makes almost no sound, and the beat resumes. If there is no clock, the men keep time by the circuit of pace and pause, and the horn at the hour's quarter plays a role as restrained as a nod. You can learn a fair amount about a command by the way its night measures minutes. Shouts waste a body. Whispers and steady beats preserve it. Beyond the wall, the desert enacts a slow epiphany. The sky holds its stars as if they were not so much above as within the dome of air you inhabit. In the third watch, the stars come closer, and sound does a similar trick. It seems to settle near the ear rather than travel across distance. You hear, faintly, the brittle touch of frost needles forming on a rim of a bucket near the cistern mouth. You hear sand hugging together under the heel of a turning sentry as the tiny beads rearrange themselves without complaint. You hear the unused tools in the little shed talk to one another as wood dries further and fiber lifts infinitesimally where a plank was cut rough. The tool voices are content because no one will put them to work until morning, and even then, only if something out of plan has demanded a repair. This is the happiness of late night. Objects fulfilling their promise by doing nothing loudly, sometimes. Rare as a lunar eclipse, the third watch receives a genuine visitor. It could be a patrol from another post, their arrival announced by a sequence of noises you recognize but almost never get to hear in this place. The discreet jingle of chain mail worn under cloak, the small cough of a horse held on a short rein. To keep bit from clanking, the dry padding of 2 more sets of feet than usual along the wall. The exchange follows a script, and the music of the script is in its lack of flourish. Challenge, reply. The mutual report delivered in the fewest words possible, that's still. Respect the weight of information this road held. That road, quiet. A shepherd's fire seen on a ridge where yesterday there was none. You can tell the men belong to a different post by the mismatch in their footfall's cadence. Not because they are wrong, but because they use a different ladder, a different set of parapet blocks, a different beat. There is no romance in the meeting, only the relief of fact traded for fact and recorded on the blank tablet that is the night, as the very bottom of morning draws near the point on the dial, when you can almost feel the sun slotting into position. Beyond the horizon, cold tests resolve. A man's hand reaches under cloak to reseat his belt where it has crept up his ribs. The buckle murmurs. Another flexes fingers, and the creases in his palm make a sound like paper being folded. The dog shakes once, chain tipping a soft clink, then settles with a huff that says, duty remains, but discomfort can be negotiated. The wind tries a new angle up the slope and fails to find any play in the wall's top timbers. The silence that follows is more meaningful than noise. It is the fort statement that arrangements made at dusk have held under pressure. The last minutes before relief have a texture different from any other interval of the night. Attention sharpens while rest stands just behind it like an obliging companion. You listen to be sure you hear the next steps, to be sure you hear the horn's low acknowledgement of time. The bakery shifts, a first scrap of dough set down on the warmed stone with an amiable slap. That sound says sugar to the brain, even if the breakfast will be nothing but a flat loaf with a scrape of oil. A camel sneezes, the dry, explosive sound that reminds you the garrison shares the air with beasts who will carry its weight again. The watchword is given one last time as tradition insists no enemy is likely to be at the ladder in these minutes. But you do not skip steps. Men climb, men descend. Belts pass hands against palms in the briefest gesture of acknowledgement that the line has remained intact in their span. When the horn finds the day and the sky agrees by shading from hard black to the vaguest suggestion of color, the desert releases the night's sounds like water too good to waste poured back into a jar. The fort answers with its 1,000 quiet noises of permission to move rope lifted off a peg. The tiny pop as a jar's wax seal cracks, rustle of a broom in a courtyard corner. You look over the parapet into the land that made your ear clever, and ask, in the smallest possible way, because such questions deserve care, out of all the ordinary sounds you learned to trust in darkness. The gates bar tightening in cold. The dog's breath. The wind counting stones along the parapet twitch. One told you most plainly that you belonged here. And when you hear it later in another place, will it carry the desert with it, or will it make a new night from scratch? Siege lines by night outside a walled city. You find the camp pressed close to the earthworks like a hand cupped around a candle. Beyond the rampart lies a city that once smelled of bread and now smells of smoke and damp mortar. Between you and its walls are trenches, palisades. Towers on wheels with their platforms covered in rawhide, and the patient, busy quiet of men who have committed to a long pressure. Night at a siege does not sound like night in open country. It sounds like a carpentry shop that has learned reverence. The last light leaves, and the first watch takes a place that has already been awake for hours. You hear, first, the mound the great ramp that must grow inch by inch settle under its own weight with a lazy sigh. Then you hear the small chorus. of shovels leaned properly against stakes, of wicker gabions set down gently so their wattles do not split, of rope unwound just enough to be ready in the morning. The siege is an argument, and night is when both sides lower their voices without conceding anything. The watch on the outermost trench changes in plain view of the enemy's wall, but with a stagecraft learned by trial. Silhouettes, low, steps. Measured to the shadows thrown by your own defenses. The guards speak as if the dirt itself were listening for information, and the dirt deserves that respect. At every turn, you hear the underlying presence of timber. Pick handles give a tiny rattle where their iron collars meet wood. The braces that stiffen the battering ram shed a last ghost of tension when the day's strain leaves them. The iron wrappings answer with a barely audible tick. The ladder you will climb on dawn for inspections stands at attention against its post with a hum where the wind finds a slit in a rung. So soft a sound that only someone who has heard it every night could place it. Inside the lines, 100. Small workshops distribute their own sets of noises at a siege. The carpenters pare wedges by lamplight, their knives hissing through fresh wood that smells green even in night. Each shaved curl falls with the softest smack on a cloth, rather. Then the bare ground, because the cloth's job is to keep chips from sounding like footsteps. The lashers twist rope and the fibers talk in a coarse whisper as they settle under strain. The onager crews do nothing as dramatic as firing. They do the small devotional acts that keep spring arms from betraying them. Atea wedge is tapped in. With a rapt mallet tap. Listen, tap. Listen until tension sings in the proper register that a trained ear can identify without drama. In your mind, it is as if these machines breathe while they sleep. The sapper's trench. The nearest thing to the enemy you can touch at night emits a different density of sound. Men down in the cut speak up through a lane of earth with clipped syllables that aim their way to ears above without wandering. Knives probe turf to find roots, their tiny scrapes amplified by the trench's geometry. When a root is cut, the release is not a pop, but a quiet laugh of soil settling. The baskets? They carry spoil up the ladder. Find new hands at the lip without a grunt, just the sound of fiber meeting palm. Someone sneezes once, the desert's old enemy dust replaced here by this city's ash. And a second hand finds a shoulder no word, only a pressure that says attention and kindness. The trench has few jokes. It has habits, and those habits sound like care at the latrine set behind a screen of stakes and brush. Night shows its ordinary face even during sieges. Men go in pairs when the enemy is known for sorties. They go singly when past weeks have taught you how bold the defenders are. Footsteps on the planks load an invisible rhythm into the air. One step hollow, one step soft. Repeat, and you are surprised by how pleasing predictability can be. A bucket nearby gets moved one hand length to the left, and you hear the dry ring of hoop iron striking the stake with the usual restraint. Even your waist at a siege is well arranged. The world reduces itself to actions that neither invite nor reject attention. You could draw a plan of this corner from sound alone. The gate that leads inward to the siege camp's heart is ceremonious without show. The passphrase for the night has been rotated through mouths before darkness took. Now it passes across. The post in a tone that would sound rude in any other context and respectful only here, where frugality is the only luxury. You hear reply after reply popping into place as the relief moves along the line. The password itself is deliberately dull, a word that makes no poetry because poetry belongs today. The point is recognition, not rhetoric. The effect is a chain of small closures, each conversation finishing itself like a latch turning into its keeper. You begin to know exactly how long each exchange will take by the time you have dipped your head deeper in the cloak to spare your cheeks from the cutting air. Fire is a conundrum in a siege. It comforts, it betrays, it hardens glue, it softens resolve. You hear the compromise worked out in this camp. Fires sit low, ringed by earth or captured stone. Their brightness cut to slits under hoods or behind shields, tilted like blankets. Against a newborn's face. Pots set on their rims chuckle gently as a barley porridge gives up a few bubbles. The lid lifts and resettles with a shy clack. A soldier holds a spoon over the steam, then lifts it and shakes once to dry it, choosing to delay warmth in the mouth in exchange for not dripping on the ground, because a drip hisses too loudly at this hour. In your tent, a brazier glows with no flame at all, just a core of red banked under ash you manage with a whisper of breath. The siege teaches breath. You learn to blow without noise. From the city, sound travels across the no man's land with a shape you begin to recognize after one night and cannot forget after 10. A gate bolt drawn back rings like iron knocked on a bell. A voice higher than you expect calls a name, and its name shapes itself against the wall and loses its center, arriving to you as pure tone without word. A wheel buckles under weight over a cobble you mentally circle on your map 1 wheel in the 4th draft animal's cart. You think as if reciting family history and you say nothing to anyone, but you add it to the logic that tells you which gate will be used at first light, which stretch of wall needs watching when the moon moves behind that cloud due west of the tower with the patched brick. You cannot help yourself. Your ear is a mason laying courses. Sometimes the defenders test you with sound, knowing that night tightens nerves, and that the cheapest attack is the one that costs only a noise. A pot dropped from the wall, a shout that names a god in a tone of mockery, a song begun and then abandoned on purpose. Your watch learns not to chase these. They are hooks with barbs of nothing attached. Instead, you attend to craft. A small hammer in a defender's hand gives off a note as it taps a pin in a ballista frame. You know it not simply because you have the same sound behind you in your own camp, but because the note is wrong. It rings too long, the pin is too loose, or the frame is too dry. You make a promise in your head to the morning carpenter, a note, to provide a path for that wrongness to make a crack in their discipline. This is how sieges teach patience, by asking you to hear flaws as they are born. Not only when they declare themselves the quartermaster's corner of the siege no one sees it unless they are looking works with little bursts of noise that prick the quiet and then disappear. A tally bag opens, counters tap, a tablet scratches once, twice, again. A crate lid is eased up and slides back into place with a flannel pad under its lip to keep the wood from speaking its full sentence. Oilcloth unfurls over a stack of javelins. With a simple sigh, you will thank those sighs later when rain comes and leaves again, having hardly been noticed. At night, gratitude takes the form of not being disturbed. Sentry pairs walk their lengths with boots that have been combed of grit with an obsessive focus. The removal of grit is not about comfort. It is about tone. Grit rings against hobnails, with a telltale jink that carries farther than whisper. You pour water on a rag, wipe the soles dry, and the sound lowers, moves into earth, where it belongs. Their spear butts come down without dull thuds. They barely touch ground at turns, then lift again. They count lengths in heartbeats and geometry. Trench angle here, sharpened stake there. Low palisade interrupted by staking points marked with little splints of willow that creak. The creak is a text, each one telling you a twig has dried too. The point where it must be replaced in the morning, or it will break with louder voice when stepped on. You make a sermon out of such texts without letting them distract you from the mass you are performing now. A watch kept with fidelity. End of first watch approaches, and, with it, the smallest swell in volume the siege allows. The horn speaks. Darkly, a private sentence only you hear. The line of men for relief carries its own smells, its own shifting. The sound of hands briefly clapping warmth back into fingers before settling to stillness again. The handoff is not intimate and not aloof. It is exact. A note transfers to faint hammer blows on the enemy tower an hour ago. A torch briefly uncovered in a slit on the north bastion. A dog barking behind a house that has not had dogs since. Yesterday, none of it calls for change. All of it calls for attention. You take your place again in the careful quiet and ask the night a question you asked it yesterday and will ask it tomorrow, as the second watch lays another layer of patient weight on these walls and trenches. Will the city answer with something more than sound, or will it continue to argue in noise what it cannot argue in action? The second watch in a siege camp is leaner than the first. The busiest chores have eased. The lines are tended. The engines sleep with their ropes loosed to a safe rest. And now the world reduces itself to listening and to maintenance that sounds like prayer. The air grows colder, and fabric tightens. Along frames, rawhide on mantelets shrinks with a fine periodic creak, as if it were trying to remember its former shape. The onager arms, wrapped in leather pads, give a low sigh when a gust finds them and presses a fraction. Their caretakers, lying wrapped nearby with one ear always on, register the note and let it pass. The guards at the sap listen for the smallest wrongness in the enemy's wallstone shifting with malice, rather than with the night's honest contraction, knowing they will be mocked from above with noise before they are attacked with stones or darts. The mockery comes. It always does. They let it break against the parapet like foam and fall back into rubble. In this watch, the siege's bureaucracy becomes audible in a way it is not by day. A runner from a rear supply park arrives without fanfare. His sandals announce him with a cadence that says he is not one of yours. The rhythm of his footfalls is a different unit's rhythm, as distinctive as an accent, and no less benign for being foreign. He gives his message, and you hear the papyrus unroll with a soft, dry crackle that carries a surprising distance. The officer on duty makes the small noises of assent that indicate he will pass the message in the morning. He does not repeat the words aloud now, because words have weight here, and he will not throw them around cheaply. The runner leaves, and the night absorbs the extra pulse his presence brought, smoothing itself like water after a pebble is dropped. The engineer's corner emits the most careful sounds of the night. A surveyor checks his line with a plumb and string inside a tent to cheat the wind. The string sings with a minute vibration when the plumb finds true. He calms it with a touch of a fingernail, makes a mark, then sets the plumb again. His assistant files the tiniest amount from a wooden wedge to make a perfect fit in the joinery of a siege tower brace. The file on wood makes a sound as hushed as the quiet in a sick room. They speak numbers as if they were vows measured, spare, never repeated. Louder than necessary, wood blocks for rollers are tested by touch. The minor voice of a knot in one block tells the engineer he will turn that face inward in the morning to spare the line any roughness. None of this will be visible to anyone but a handful of men. The siege listens anyway and steadies itself. On the discipline in those whispers from the city, a counter-song rises, different from the brash calls of the earlier hour. Now you hear lullabies, perhaps, or work songs from women grinding in courtyards by low coals. They sound like breathing with shape added. A gate's hinges cry deeper now, perhaps greased with something found late, perhaps failing. You cannot tell from one note, but you hear the continuity of life in there, the ordinary, brave insistence on eating, washing, bedding down, everything done under pressure and made normal by repetition. You are not sentimental about it, but you are not deaf to it either. You recognize in that sound the same thing you prosecute on your side of the trench: survival by dull excellence. To your rear, further inside the siege lines, the animal park gathers its own register. Oxen cough weightily, mules stamp and scrape iron rings on palings. A horse blows its lips and snorts a little silt from the day's feed. Their handlers are the most patient men in any army. You hear them move among the animals with a vocabulary that belongs to sound rather than words, tongue clicks. Low hums, a single sharp whistle tamped at the end to keep it from traveling too far. Leather brushes ring subtle when bristles hit metal without intention. A feed sack lands with a soft collision against a thigh, then falls to earth with a full, muffled thump. Which is the best thump in the world at a siege. It means grain wear. It should be not on the ground, not lost to damp or vermin. The ordinary ailments of a siege settle in the second watch. In the medic's tent, you hear the same tap-tap of pestle you might in a desert fort. But here the scent is different. Camphor and smoke, and sometimes wine thinned with water to clean a scrape. The bandaged jar lid is eased with a twist, rather than pried and laid down within reach. The jar speaks clay impatiently, if handled roughly, and no one has patience for anything that makes more noise than is needed. A man with chilblains slips in and out without comment. A man with a cough receives a draft and a hand on the shoulder. A man with a sore rubbed raw under the arm by shield rim has it soothed with oil and told to seat the strap deeper tomorrow. You hear the medic's voice once when he gives a lecture to a fool with a bent nail he pulled with his teeth, lecture pitched low and therefore powerful. The fool nods, and even the nod feels like a sound of assent. Time in this watch is partly kept by a series of internal patrols, an invisible spoke system that prevents the center from getting hollow. These patrols take different routes each night, but their steps are uniform enough that you mistake order for uniformity. They turn corners with the same economy your fingers use to turn a page. Once they cross the inner lane, you mark the moment. It means your watch is halfway through and that the third will begin with a recalibration to colder air and stiffer people. The horn you expect comes at the interval you expect. If it did not, tenderness and terror would rise in equal measure. You would fear for error or admire discretion. Tonight, things follow the music written earlier. On the enemy wall, you hear the persistence of their craft. A ballista arm is moved, and the creak says the tension remains honest. A stone rolled into place for dropping thuds with a tone that tells you it is too round to nest well. When stones nest, the sound is different, deader, less ring. You note it without telling anyone. It joins the archive of small advantage you store in the muscles of your face and the set of your jaw. If the defenders attempt a sortie in this watch, and the prudent ones seldom do, you will hear it first in a human misstep, a foot placed too eagerly on loose rubble near their sally port, a scuffle, an oath cut short. You wait for that wrongness, and bless each moment you do not get it. Because a night without sorties is a night that leaves you as you are, tired but intact. Near the ladders that drop into the forward trenches, the talk turns to rope. Rope that must be ready. Rope that must be spared from damp. Rope that phrase must be cut now rather than later to avoid a noisier, more dangerous failure under daylight watch. A lasher pulls apart a short length to salvage the good strands for tying where the eye will not see. The separated fibers whisper like grass rubbed between finger and thumb. He twists new ends, spits lightly, finishes with a motion so practiced it could be a prayer, and tests the loop with a tug that is more feel than force. He places the good coil where a hand will find it in a hurry. He places the frayed coil where no hand will find it by accident. The distinction makes its own music in your head. The quiet that closes the second watch comes with a thought that is gentle and unwelcome at once. No matter how many watches you keep, sieges measure human steadiness. More than bravery. Bravery belongs to moments. Steadiness belongs to hours. You adjust your cloak. Make one more note to yourself about the wrong-sounding hinge on the city gate. The off-pitch pin in their ballista. The crease in your own tower's roar hides too dry at one edge. The horn for handoff comes, and with it the shuffle of feet increasing by just enough to reset the line. You wonder as you step aside if the third watch will let the siege breathe more deeply, or whether the coldest hours will tighten every joint. And whether, when the light comes, you will be able to say which of tonight's tiny sounds turned out to be the hinge on which the next day swung. The third watch is a teacher as blunt as the city's wall. It strips the camp of warmth without malice, and it asks for strict attention without drama. Your ears wake up even if your eyes are heavy. The first thing you hear is fabric rawhide stretched over towers, canvas over mantlets shrinking to its cold measure. A line tightens and murmurs. A tied cord that was slack earlier now hums when wind kisses it, and you register where to put a hand in the morning to ease that hum back to quiet. Timber, now stiff, makes its complaint in little ladders of sound that travel along braces. Battering ram sling, left slack enough to be safe at night, surrenders the last of its day's memory with a soft, accepting creak. If a unit were careless, the sounds would pile into a clatter. In your camp, they stack into a chord. And the chord says control. Breath shows itself in smoke from low fires. And breath sounds everywhere within the line's human-animal machine. Men pace on the near parapet with steps exactly measured. They check stakes one by feel, because their fingers can tell what their eyes cannot in this dark. Finger on stake says it is firm. Finger on rope says it is sound. Knuckle wraps parapet timber softly. Once, twice, proofing for rot. Another man counts peg to peg along a line like a monk counting beads, each tap exactly like the last, and therefore restful. The sappers in their trench hold silence like a dare. They listen for countersap from the defenders, the enemy's miners who might answer underground labor with their own. Your ear learns to tell earth on earth from wood on wood. When you hear earth on earth, it means close labor. When you hear wood on wood, it means the defenders are moving timbers behind the wall to make something heavy for later. A messenger arrives during the third watch, sometimes, though rarely. He's the kind who comes thin with a face practiced. In not announcing itself, you hear him by the lack of unnecessary noise. No jingle in the harness, no ring in the bit, no slap in the stirrup leather. He speaks numbers low to the officer at the line. How many carts in the last convoy? How many faggots of brush on the next? How long to expect the mules? Then he goes. Numbers at this hour sound like a lullaby to those who love order. That is why you keep men on this earthworks who love numbers. From the city, a ritual sound begins to recur in third watches. A bucket chain over a well turning in a cadence that says rationing. The chain clinks, then slackens, then clinks again. And you time the draw with your internal clock against the pattern of your own patrol. You hear someone in their cough in a dozen little bursts. You hear someone soothe a child. You hear a door bar set with a shock that tells of anger or carelessness or weariness. Choose your story. You choose none of them and leave room for mornings. Facts to fill the shape you've drawn in your ear. The danger of the third watch is invention. Sound invites it, and your craft is refusal. You calibrate cold now with wood. The siege tower at your right has a plank that only speaks below a certain temperature. A quick, hard click at the 10 count of a footfall passing under it. You use it as your own water clock. When the clicks shorten and then disappear, you know, the cold has stopped deepening and is holding. You feel a foolish pride in your private measure and then forgive yourself. Men under pressure are allowed their small, harmless rituals, especially when those rituals reflect close attention to the things that hold you up. There is maintenance, even here. A rawhide panel has tightened unevenly on one corner of a mantelet. The guard closest to it sets his spear aside, steps under the sheltering lip, and works the edge with gloved fingers until the tone of the tautness deadens to match the rest. He hums once not a tune, a vibration to feel the panel's resonance in his palms, then returns to his post. No one saw him. 3 people heard him. Everyone will benefit. A rope has been chafed on a peg. A man picks up a worn scrap of leather and wraps the peg, and you hear the leather's voice as it tightens, a gentle scuff, and then stillness. A ladder rung has begun to talk when weight finds it. A man marks it with a thumbprint of soot to remind mourning hands to swap it out. These are increments. Sieges proceed by increments or not at all. On the enemy wall, a movement looks like a movement until sound proves it otherwise. A figure at a crenel leans and withdraws, and you brace for the scrape of a missile's frame or the thump of a dropped. Wait, none comes. Instead, the figure retches an unlovely sound that carries as cleanly as a trumpet in the cold night hand. You stand down while staying straight. And you remember that the other side endures the same hunger, the same fear, the same dryness, the same boredom, the same stretchy hours. You permit yourself no pity, only the stable recognition that you and they share a profession done after the sun goes, which is to keep a watch and keep it well. Rain surprises everyone in a siege, and third watch rain is the boldest. It arrives without the courtesies of smell and wind shift, and simply licks the earthworks with a sound like sewing. A steady stitch into the fabric of the night. Mud appears in the listeners' mouths as a taste before it appears underfoot as risk. You hear the tarp covers accept their duty with little drumheads rattles. You hear drainage channels work or fail, and you fix them where failure speaks. Too loudly, the enemy's wall changes voice under rain. Mortar softens, stone grows slicker, steps on parapet, and stairs slop. This is data you will use when morning allows. You place it next to the note about the wrong-sounding gate hinge. Next to the too round stone, next to the too dry hide. Your ledger overflows with such notes. The trick is to keep the book open without letting it write you instead of you writing it. Relief nears. The horn that admits the approach is as respectful as a bow in a small room. Hand swap spear shafts, 4 blanket corners. Belts unhook and are set on pegs where the leather will not cool into a stubborn curl. The men coming on smell like wool and sleep and the inside of cloaks. They will smell like rope and wood and dirt in an hour. They receive the watchword and return it, not like a secret, but like a tool. The night which has tolerated your care, now for hours, makes its last gift, the softest sound the siege knows. From the rear of the lines, under a low shelter, someone lays the first loaves on a warm stone, and the bread answers with a friendly, confident thump. Dawn finds you not with a blaze, but with a thinning. The city shows itself as a geometry instead of a wall, and the camp answers by shedding its concern for silhouettes and beginning to act, as if men and materials were allowed to call themselves by their names. The onagers will be tested aloud. The carpenters will recruit the day's young muscle again. The surveyor will stand on his line without a tent to hide his plumb. Before that, you take one more turn along the sap, one more hand across a stakes point, one more ear to the ground, for nearshore digging by the enemy. What you hear is not heroic. It is weight, the pressure of patience layered for weeks. You step down from the parapet and let the day come, and you carry one last quiet question with you to breakfast, of the countless small sounds. Woven together in darkness, the creak of rawhide, the hum of line, the soft tap on a wedge, the wrong ring of a distant hinge. One will you treat as a command when the sun lifts and orders are shouted? And will that obedience make the day's work more ordinary, or will it reveal that the ordinary was the victory all along?